Good morning and welcome to the 32nd meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. Sarah Boyack will be joining the committee, hopefully shortly, as a substitute for Monica Lennon for items 2 and 3 on the Ecocide Bill. Under Rule 9.13a of our standing orders, Monica Lennon is not entitled to exercise the rights of a committee member in relation to these items. That's simply because she's the member in charge of the bill. Monica, however, will be present for the evidence session on the bill, like all other members of the Scottish Parliament, she's entitled to attend our public evidence sessions, and also I always think it's important to get the chance to ask questions. When we get to the later agenda items, which don't concern the Ecocide Bill, Monica is entitled to rejoin and take part in those agenda items in her capacity as a committee member. And it will be at that stage that Sarah Boyack will not take part in the items and move away from the committee. I hope that's all clear. So our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking items 3, 5 and 6 in private. Item 3 is a consideration of the evidence heard under the Ecocide Bill. Evidence 5 is a consideration of the evidence heard under the Sustainable Aviation Fuel. And item 6 is consideration of the committee's work programme. To ensure that we carefully adhere to the standing orders, I'm going to split this into 2 questions. Firstly, to ask whether we're all agreed in taking items 3 in private, noting that Monica Lennon may not participate in that decision. As I've said, this is because she's a member in charge of that bill. I'll then ask if we're agreed in taking items 5 and 6 in private. And of course, Monica may take part in that decision. It's all very complicated. I realise it's rather complicated, but I'm afraid that's the way it is. So, with Monica Lennon not taking part from this decision, do we agree to take item 3 in private? We are agreed. Do we also, now with Monica taking part, agree to take items 5 and 6 in private? We are agreed. Okay. Gosh, a complicated start, and we haven't even got into the evidence. Our second item of business this morning is an evidence session on the Ecocide Scotland Bill. This will be our third evidence session on the bill, which has been referred to the committee for consideration at stage 1. We're gathering evidence on the general principles of the bill before we report to Parliament. The Parliament has not yet set a stage 1 deadline. Today we'll hear from a panel of witnesses who have expertise in how we currently use the law and other forms of regulation to deal with serious environmental damage in Scotland. And I welcome, turned over 2-page, Ross Haggart, the Chief Operations Officer for Regulations for the Business Environment, and also SEPA, Professor Sarah Hendry, Dundee Law School, University of Dundee, Professor Campbell Gemmell, environmental consultant and former CEO of the South Australian Environmental Protection Agency and of SEPA, Clive Mitchell, the head of terrestrial science for Nature Scott, and Mark Roberts, the Chief Executive, Environmental Standards Scotland. Thank you for all attending this morning. Now, I've said to those people who are present in the room that it's quite a large panel of 5 witnesses, and therefore to say that you agree with somebody who's already been asked the question is nothing to be ashamed of, but it does help me manage the time of all the committee members who want to ask questions. So where you can agree and keep it as simple as that, I would appreciate it. But obviously, if you want to add something that somebody's missed or you think needs added to, then that's fine as well. So let's go with question 1, which is me. So, to what extent is the current regulatory landscape in Scotland equipped to both punish and deter instances of severe environmental damage? And is there a gap in the law, is my question, which would justify this bill? So I'm going to start with Mark, work along, and then come to people online. Mark.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. ESS very much welcomes the principle and the intention behind the bill to establish a very strong deterrent against most serious environmental harms that may happen in the future. We think there are some clarifications that we would be looking for in terms of how the bill would actually work in practice, and that's this type of thing. However, in principle, we think it's a positive thing that would sit at the very top of the overall legislative and regulatory pyramid that already exists.
I again would like to echo support for the bill and its intentions. I think there are some points that could be clarified in terms of whether the current regime is sufficient. This clearly seeks to go beyond to a more severe level of harm and a significantly higher penalties, and that would allow Scotland to align with the Environmental Crime Directive, for example. So it may be that there is a breach of the law for which the current penalties are not sufficient, perhaps.
Okay. Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Morning Committee. Similar to other panel members thus far, SEPA is supportive of the ambition of the bill to impose severe penalties for those individuals and organisations that cause the most serious environmental harm, especially those that are acting recklessly or wilfully. We know from our almost 30 years as Scotland's environmental regulator that deterring and preventing environmental harm are much better to protecting people and nature than pursuing enforcement or prosecution after harm has occurred. But similarly to other panel members, there are some points we would make in terms of how this integrates with existing legislation and also some points of clarification in relation to the bill. Thank you.
Okay, Campbell.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I agree with a significant part of what's already been said, but I probably disagree in terms of the adequacy of the arrangements. In 2019, I produced a report for Scottish Environment Link outlining some of the strengths and weaknesses of the existing environmental governance framework, and I think, without going into those in detail just now, they still stand, and I think a significant review of the effectiveness of the existing elements of the governance system is still missing. And in addition, I think I would provide further support for the Ecocide proposed bill, because I think it would indeed, as Mark said, sit at the apex of the current arrangements. Whether it would be adequate, I think is something that only actual enforcement and practice in due course would show.
Okay, and Clive.
Thank you, Convener. So I'm going to agree mostly with everything that everybody has said so far. I think the bill can provide an important kind of scaffolding for the existing environmental governance architecture. And we support the aim, unsurprisingly, to protect the environment in Scotland, covering all natural resources, air, water, soil, wild fauna and flora, including habitats. I think our main concern, particularly in terms of gaps, is that the main drivers of biodiversity loss identified, highlighted a few years ago by the IPBES Global Assessment in 2019, IPBES being to biodiversity what IPCC is for climate change, identified the main drivers of biodiversity loss as habitat loss and fragmentation, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive non-native species, all of which interact together, but most importantly, accumulate over time. And a lot of the current state of climate nature globally and rising countries is more to do with death by 1,000 cuts, if you like, rather than a series of kind of catastrophic steps towards the current situation. So I think it's that kind of accumulative attrition that wouldn't obviously be addressed by the bill as it stands, as far as I can see.
Okay, thank you. Just one further question in this area is, I always think as a parliamentarian, if we're asked to do something, we do it because there's either a deficiency or there's going to be a big improvement. Now, Section 40 offence under the Regulatory Reform Act 2014 provides a way of prosecuting individuals for causing severe environmental damage. It's never, ever been used. So why do we need something else if we're not using what we've got already? You don't all have to answer that question, but who'd like to go first? By the way, if you all look away at the same time, I'll nominate somebody. So, Ross, you were the slowest on that. You're off.
Thanks very much, Convener. So Section 40 of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Act provides punishments for significant environmental harm, and that is obviously at the upper end of the enforcement arrangements that SEPA has. SEPA takes proportionate enforcement action based on the actions of individuals, the evidence we are able to gather and the impact that that has on the environment. We have reported in the past individuals and companies to Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service under Section 40. So we have made Section 40 reports to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal 2 in the past. But they have not been taken, well, one has not been taken forward by Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, and the other is still with them for marking. So it is something that we do utilise, but it is for the most significant environmental harms, which within our regulatory sphere we don't see happening that often. And the kind of numbers that we've seen coming through that we've reported to COPFS in relation to that Section 40 powers are of the magnitude that is set out within the financial memorandum for the bill in that kind of once in 10 to 20 year events. So very similar types of significant events we see coming through, very similar timescales. We do report them to COPFS, but by their very nature they don't happen hugely often.
Okay, so just so I've got this right in my mind, 2 events in 11 years, one of which wasn't taken forward and one is still waiting to be assessed. So it doesn't strike me that there's a huge amount of urgency for more legislation in this area if we're not using it already. Clyde, do you want to come back on that?
Thank you. I can do. I mean, I agree with actually most of everything that Ross has said. We've considered using the environmental liability regulations, or sorry, Section 40, in 11 incidents, including 3 that were referred to us by an interested party. We've worked with various other agencies to examine those cases, but have none of them have kind of got to the point where we would involve either the police or the Crown or COPFS, so they've not progressed. So similar kind of story to Ross's.
Okay, I'm still struggling in my mind to understand that we're adding something to the armoury to make up for a deficiency or a perceived deficiency, and we've not used the weapons that we've got to resolve that deficiency, perceived deficiency, in 11 years. It seems a sort of additional add-on that's not required. Am I missing something? Sarah, you're looking as though you're going to disagree with me.
Not to disagree, but I suppose one difference between this bill and Section 40 is that there isn't a permit defence that I can see on the face of this bill, whether there is in Section 40. So that would be one difference. I also think it's interesting, to me, the definition in this bill is not sufficiently different on the face of it. So significant harm and severe harm, but both talk about serious adverse consequences. So this bill perhaps could be clearer what the difference is, scale difference, but there certainly are differences between this and Section 40. To me, this is much more akin to a criminal offence where there's a very high requirement for mens rea, but there isn't a clear permit defence.
Campbell, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, please. I think your initial question is a very good one. And for me, it's a matter of, is this absence of evidence or evidence of absence? I think both of the regulatory bodies in question have expressed, and people have expressed on their behalf, concerns about their ability to be effective given the resources available to them. And it is curious, if you look over a decadal period, that the number of public complaints and concerns about environmental condition that have been raised with both bodies have virtually doubled, whilst the number of prosecutions has significantly declined, almost to 0. That raises a number of questions about whether or not have we all missed the fact that the environment has suddenly become absolutely perfect and everyone is completely compliant with the law. Some of a more cynical nature, and perhaps who travel more widely, might think that there are still problems out there and that they need to be policed. The essence of your question, though, I think is absolutely spot on. I think there is a need for significantly clearer definition about what constitutes ecocide as opposed to what constitutes another kind of, as it were, more run-of-the-mill environmental crime. I think we've got a little bit further to go on that, but the principle, especially as expressed in Belgium and Sweden and one or two other European countries where ecocide has been placed at the top of the sort of regulatory structure, is highly desirable, but only if it and other pieces of environmental legislation are effectively enforced. And I would seriously question as to whether or not at the moment they are.
Okay, so in my brain, it looks like we're getting a bigger stick to replace a stick that we have already, which isn't used properly because we haven't got enough resource. So what you're suggesting, unless I've got this wrong, Campbell, is that we resource the use of the stick that we have before taking a bigger stick, which we won't have the resources to use either.
I wouldn't make it a polar choice because I think both are appropriate. And as I say, I raised the issue the best part of 8 years ago, and I've had a number of discussions with colleagues in Strathclyde Law School before I retired in March about that issue. There is a need to have ecocide for alignment reasons with the EU, which we said we would do in Scotland, but also because there is no such extreme top example of systemic damage, which I think does need to be in place. But I would, in parallel, and frankly rather faster and with a greater priority, see there being a need to implement properly that which we have. Okay, and just before I leave this, just one question to you, Campbell, and I apologise to any committee member if I'm standing on their toes on a question they want to ask in relation to this. If this had been introduced 30 years ago, how many times would it have been used in your impression, Campbell? I would say a handful. At most. I think there are interesting issues about liability and whether or not liability is a forward-looking or a retrospective power. But the fact that we have had, and you've, I think, previous witnesses raised the issues about persistent organic pollutants, PFAS, PFOA, etc., microplastics, issues around salmon farming and the way in which particularly questionable chemicals have been used to deal with sea lice. There is a handful of issues where there could have been evidentiary material assembled in order to pursue an ecocide case, but I would say it is a handful. Okay. Thank you, and I move now to the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson, who's got some questions. Michael.
Good morning. I want to maybe just sort of pick up on the theme that was identified by the convener around the existing provisions in Section 40. And a couple of you in particular, Mark, you mentioned that the deterrence effect that this legislation could potentially have, and others agreed with that. I wonder if you could maybe just set out what evidence is there that the existing provisions in Section 40 are effectively working as a deterrent just now, given the sanctions which are attached to that particular provision, which you would then say, if you ramp it up under an ecocide bill, it will have an even bigger impact. What's the evidence base of that?
I think it's quite a difficult question to answer in terms of we're dealing with a sort of slightly unknown type of case that would sort of be an incident that would sort of be subject to prosecution under this proposed bill. Part of having a very big deterrent for a significant environmental harm would be to try and prevent that from happening, and it's almost like an unknown in the future what type of event would be there to defend against, but that's not a reason for not doing it. There are risks in the environment which are largely controlled even and constrained by the existing regulatory and legislative system. But that big unknown that's out there in the future is something which should be there to be prevented or ameliorated against.
Okay. Sarah, given your legal expertise, is there a strong evidence base to demonstrate that regulations of this nature or a bill of this nature with an offence of this nature has a significant impact on acting as a deterrent?
I think our argument would be based on...
That question was to Sarah.
Oh, sorry.
I would tend to agree with Mark. It's very difficult to have an evidence base for a deterrent effect. But I do think that potentially the passage, particularly of a specific bill, rather than changing Section 40 with the very high penalties, would probably attract some attention, regulatory attention, press attention, corporate attention, and that might strengthen the potential for that deterrent effect. I suppose it's a question of whether this is to capture the one-off terrible incident, in which case that's what large corporations especially should be very mindful of, and an increased penalty might increase the deterrence as well.
So is it fair to say then there is no evidential base to say that a higher offence provided within a bill will create a deterrence? It might, but there's no actual evidence to demonstrate that. Is that correct?
I'm not aware of an evidence base for that as such, but I think it would be surprising if there was no deterrence effect in terms of corporate behaviour and understanding and concern.
Okay. Ross?
Thanks. I agree with what's been said already. And in terms of specific offences that may come under the scope of the Ecocide Bill, it's difficult to speculate on what that may be, but what SEPA does is we gather all the evidence available, we determine an appropriate course of action, and where appropriate we report into the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, as I've already stated. Professor Gemmell mentioned keeping pace with European environmental law. That's really a decision for Government and Parliament, and not one that SEPA would form a view on. However, what we do recognise is that criminals don't recognise boundaries, and if one jurisdiction becomes harder to operate in, then people may move into other jurisdictions, and that's why we believe that the deterrent effect in Scotland would be really powerful to avoid criminals moving to jurisdictions where there might not be such a strong legislative framework in place.
Okay. Have you saw evidence of that happening in other jurisdictions?
I'm not aware of any evidence, Mr Matheson, specifically.
It's just your gut instinct.
It's just what we work with regulators and other enforcement bodies across the UK and across Europe, and that's our professional view.
I'm just trying to get to the evidence base for some of the points that have been made too, as to whether they can be substantiated as you've set out. I want to stick with this theme around, though, the existing regulatory environment which we have, and the suggestion, I think it would be fair to say, from Professor Campbell-Gemmell, which is about the existing regulatory framework we have in place at the present moment, whether it is operating effectively or being utilised effectively. And in particular, I want to turn to Clive, because in evidence from the Nature Scot, you state that the Environmental Liability Scotland Regulations 2009 provide an existing route for requiring remediation of environmental damage. But at the present time, you believe, and I quote, the thresholds which apply is very high, and so they've been rarely used. Can I maybe just ask if you could expand on that? Because I'm trying to understand, is there a need for us to have a fundamental look at the existing regulatory framework before we add anything new to it in order to identify how it could be improved? Clive.
Thank you. Yes. So, yes, sorry, the cases I referred to earlier were to do with the operation of the environmental liability regulations, where we had considered using it in 11 incidents over the last several years, including the 3 that were referred to us by an interested party. As I said, we worked with other agencies, including local authorities, other relevant national bodies, but didn't get to a point where we thought we could involve the police or the COPFS to progress those issues. So they have been, the cases that we've looked at have been complex. It's sometimes been difficult to prove an individual as a potential liability. The other kind of point I'd make on the difference between the proposed bill and the existing framework is that for us, the prosecutions available under the Environmental Liability Regulations, Nature Conservation Scotland Act, Conservation of Natural Habitats Regulations for sites, special areas of conservation and special protection areas under the Habitats Directives and so on, all concern activities on protected areas, whereas and don't include any provisions for the damage being or the harm being severe. So the problems we've encountered in giving effect to that have been to do with attribution as opposed to severity of the incident, as it were. And obviously the Ecocide bill, as proposed, would consider the whole of Scotland rather than just those bits that fall under the sort of protected area canopy.
Okay, thanks. I think Campbell wanted to come in.
Thank you. Thank you. It was partly at an earlier point in what you were saying there that demonstrating deterrence is particularly challenging for all of us, although crime figures are going to be used in that regard. Impel, which is part of the European structure looking at the way in which environmental legislation is implemented across member states, has produced a whole variety of reports. So has OECD, because they produce annual performance reports for each member state against the existing environmental acquis. And for waste law, for example, there's very clear demonstration of a dramatic drop in waste offences in certain categories after either new law or significant increases in penalties were applied. So there are a whole series of lesser, I admit, but other criminal areas where, for the environment, there has been a cultural change or a change in actual performance as a result of an elevation of fine or a change of law. I would be very surprised were there not some similar deterrent effect in this case. And I just wanted to mention one thing. One of the projects I worked on earlier this year with the World Bank was in Moldova. And one of the things that they particularly wanted in terms of their journey towards alignment with the EU before they get into the membership journey was they wanted to pursue an ecocide model and particularly both retrospective and forward-looking environmental liability directive implementation, particularly because they had had an egregious case of a combined refinery and metal working plant that had essentially got away with very high levels of environmental harm over a very long period. And they felt they did not have the tools and couldn't see within the existing EU acquis an appropriate tool to deal with the harm that had been caused there. And I found that very interesting that without being prompted by the consultant, they were focused on that. So I think these are some of the evidence base is qualitative, I accept, but some of it is also quantitative, that dramatic change can be accomplished.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I suppose you could get into a debate depending on where what's your starting point in terms of environmental regulations and environmental law, and then you get into the whole issue of once you create a criminal offence, if that's the case, then there's an issue about enforcement of that offence as well, which again, it depends what your starting point was as well. So I'm interested in this issue of when people say that it will create a deterrence, is that what's the evidence base to actually support that from where we are just now? Because at one point we're suggesting actually we've had an increase in the number of complaints, but the number of prosecutions has actually almost reached nil. Does that mean we've got a greater level of environmental harm taking place now as a result of the fact that we don't see the level of enforcement that you would expect? So there's an interesting relationship in there which I think would need to be explored. Can I pick up though on the issue around the Regulatory Reform Act and Section 60, because SEPA and their written evidence suggests that an alternative route to the Ecocide Bill could be to create an offence which is equivalent to ecocide by amending the Regulatory Reform Act. Do you think that would be a preferred route to deal with this, rather than introducing a new piece of legislation?
One of the concerns that we've got, Mr Matheson, is that if you've got two offences with some overlap in them, that could cause some uncertainty regarding the legislative framework that we work within. So there's an existing legislative framework, there's Section 40 of the Regulatory Reform Act, and we believe that an alternative to a separate ecocide bill could be to amend Section 40 of the Regulatory Reform Act to bring in the level of punishments that we see within the ecocide bill, rather than having a separate bill, and that would hopefully provide greater clarity within the regulatory landscape, and have a single offence that covers both significant and severe environmental harm, because within the Regulatory Reform Act it talks about significant environmental harm and it's severe environmental harm within the ecocide bill. So we think there's an opportunity to amend existing legislation to have the same effects as the ecocide bill would.
Okay, so are you concerned that if the ecocide bill was to be introduced as it stands at the present moment, in creating this new offence, is that there is a danger of confusion between both the ecocide bill and the Section 40 part of the Regulatory Reform Act?
Yeah, and in terms of, and if it's an issue that, so if the environmental harm is caused by an issue that's within SEPA's regulatory powers, then we could, if there were two separate offences, we could report both into Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. However, we just think it would be a more clear way if the existing legislation was amended rather than bringing in new legislation. And it's very much along the same lines as what we are doing at the moment with environmental regulation. Members may be aware that on the 1st of November we brought in a new integrated authorisations framework that brings together our four biggest regimes into the same framework. So that's for water, waste, industrial activities and radioactivity. So that's using the existing legislation to streamline, make the legislation more effective, which is better for us as a regulator and also for businesses as well. So we think that by amending existing legislation, it will continue that streamlining, simplification of legislation.
Okay. Mark, can I ask you this issue as well? Do you think it would be more effective to actually deal with this, or maybe not more effective, but it would be a more simplified form if we were to amend the existing regulatory framework that's in place?
As I said in answer to the convener's opening question, one of the issues that we have is around the sort of some areas of clarification that we think are necessary, and one of those is the overlap between the Regulatory Reform Act and the proposed bill, and which one would be selected under which circumstances as the mechanism for prosecution. So I think that is something where there could be greater clarification. We don't have a view really in terms of which one is preferable, but there is certainly a need for clarification as to which one would be the most appropriate mechanism.
Okay. I don't know if any other witnesses want to comment on it. Sarah?
I would agree that it would be possible to achieve most of the aims of this bill by amending Section 40, and that might have more regulatory clarity around the differences. But if what the Parliament wants is a headline bill that would attract that publicity in the best possible sense, then maybe the way to do that is a freestanding bill.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'm not sure it's what Parliament wants. It's what we're trying to achieve is good legislation, and that's why we're considering this bill in some depth. I'm going to go to the next questions, which will come from Mark Ruskell. Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to turn to how ecocide is defined within this bill, and to get your thoughts on that. And I know that both Nature Scott and SEPA have raised some thoughts around the definition of widespread and long-term harm. So can I start with those points and go to Clive and then Ross, and then I'll bring in other members of the panel. Clive.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, widespread can be just, we felt it could be hard to define in open, complex ecological systems, even to the point, what is meant by impacting and what the consequences of those impacts might be. So all of which could be disputed without clarity on particularly what the purpose of both the action might have been and what we take to be healthy ecosystems, which can, those definitions can vary a little bit depending on, what the purpose of the management of the area might be. So without clarity or examples to illustrate, how those terms might operate in practice, we felt that might be difficult to operate as it stands, but with some further guidance on what those terms mean and what they might mean in different settings to illustrate, the scope and intent of the bill and what might be covered, that could be addressed.
Okay, is 12 months an adequate definition of long term?
For damage to habitats and species, we felt that nearly all of those instances would require a lot longer than 12 months recovery time.
Okay.
So, for example, I was up in the Flow Country last week looking at the effects of a significant fire in 2019. There's still signs of changes, a slow recovery, but it is a slow recovery.
Okay. Ross?
Yeah, if I can maybe pick up Professor Henry's earlier point regarding if it's the will of Parliament to have a separate offence and a separate bill, then I think clear guidance would be required between when Section 40 would apply or when the Ecocide Bill would apply. Because as I've already discussed, we've got slightly different definitions between one and the other of significant and severe environmental harm. And I think also definitions round about widespread long-term would be really helpful. The other thing that I would mention is that the Ecocide Bill talks about acts causing severe environmental harm, and we would suggest that it might be beneficial to include omissions as well, because omissions as well as acts could result in environmental harm as well, and that would broaden out the definition and probably bring it more in line with the Section 40 definition.
Yeah, okay, and I think that's a point that's also been raised by ERCS as well in evidence. Can I turn to others now then? Sarah, do you want to come in on this?
All I would say on widespread is that in Section 40, it refers to local as well as wider geographical areas up to national. And I do wonder if widespread here is beyond a limited geographic area. I'm not sure that it wouldn't be possible to have a very severe event that would affect a very localised species badly, but wouldn't extend beyond that wider area. So I'm not sure that widespread might be too widely defined.
Okay. Mark?
I agree with everything that's been said in terms of the needs for additional clarification around some of these terms. The only point I would add to this is echoing something that Clive Mitchell said earlier about the importance of cumulative effects, where there are a series of individual events which build up over time to cause very significant environmental harm. I think Clive Mitchell used the phrase death by 1,000 cuts. So that, again, how would that fit into this legislation is also in need of clarification.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree with the point that was made around emissions as well as acts needing to be? Okay. Campbell?
I agree with what Mark and others have just said. I think a scoping process and a scoping documentation would be extremely helpful because I think we could become obsessed about definitions of some of those individual words. They need to be expanded into meaningful examples. And I think particularly where Clive mentioned wildfires, or whether they're arson or natural or whatever, proof of recovery can be very difficult depending on timescales of environmental events like rain. There are lots of other components of that, and persistent chemicals in the environment can reside within a groundwater body for 25 years before the effects become obvious. Look at what's happened to the mining industry, for example, in Ayrshire, and after the pumps are switched off, the flushes of extremely unpleasant waters took a considerable amount of time. So, and it also highlights how good our monitoring is and how effective the networks of reporting are on these things, and whether we're actually paying attention to the monitoring data. So we really need, I would say, a much clearer set of scoping observations and limits and criteria in order to be able to apply this. And I think it's also why I would be reluctant to turn the sort of unicorn of Section 40 of the 2014 Act into a further palimpsest of adding other bits and pieces to it. I think use what we have, but define very carefully what we additionally need, but keep the outcomes in mind that we're actually trying to achieve. I think messing around with that which we have is not the smartest way of dealing with this. It either needs a wholesale review, which could be very time-consuming and so forth, or it needs left alone as is and create the ecocide legislation and definitions much more clearly separately.
So you're saying then that effectively applying surgery to Section 40 is problematic without there being a much wider review of environmental regulation and governance?
Yes, that would be my view. I completely accept that people within SEPA might have a very different view, but I think tinkering can be damaging, and it was rightly a slow and considered process of getting from 2010 to 2014 to create the RRA. I would be reluctant to see further tinkering at this point. I think there is a need for, as some of us have already said, a completely separate piece of legislation to sit at the top of the current arrangements rather than fiddling with what we have.
Okay, if I could move on then to thresholds for liability within the bill. So the bill requires intent or recklessness for the main offences in Section 1, or consent or connivance for responsible officials of organisation. And, we have had some evidence which suggests that the bill should also look at provisions around negligence or strict liability. I'd like to get your thoughts on whether thresholds in the bill are appropriate at the moment or whether they could be adjusted. Sarah, would you like to start?
Indeed. Well, I think intent and recklessness are high bars to meet, as is perhaps appropriate for criminal offences with very high penalties. So this is not designed as a strict liability offence. I think that's a difficult bar to reach for corporate liability. So I know there are people who would say that for corporations it should be strict liability, which it's not. I read the bill as corporations are held to that same standard. I think if it's strict liability for corporations with these sorts of penalties, then there probably should be a permit defence. So I think at the moment you have to show that whether it's a human person or a legal person, that they either intended or were reckless, and that probably is the right level of culpability for such high penalties, but it would be difficult to reach. I think for the responsible officials, if you like, the individuals within corporate liability, it would probably be appropriate to add in neglect and the kind of standard formulations, so consent, connivance or neglect, but they won't be liable until the corporate body or the entity has been held culpable on that much higher standard. I think that's a challenge.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
I don't have a lot further to add to that. I mean, for very serious penalties, the bar needs to be very high, and so I think the definitions of intent and recklessness are appropriate.
Thank you. Campbell?
Oops, thank you. I don't have anything to add. I agree with Sarah.
Okay. Thank you. Ross?
Yeah, I agree with what the panellists have said so far. The only thing I would add is Professor Henry mentioned permit defence. I would also like to highlight the fact that there's currently no defence in the bill for a permitting authority. which authorises activities that result in ecocide. So that defence protects regulators like SEPA, where we authorise activities in accordance with environmental law, and that's currently something that Section 40 includes at the moment.
Okay. Is there a point, though, about needing to hold regulators to account if there was a situation where a regulator was reckless? I think it's maybe a question for Tamark.
That would then fall into environmental standards, Scotland's remit in terms of oversight and scrutiny of what SEPA or Nature Scot as regulators were doing. But of course, our sanctions that we have available to us are much more limited. So.
Okay. Clive? Anything to add around thresholds?
Sorry, I was waiting to be unmuted. So, yes, in terms of the current drafting, in terms of intent and recklessness, that fits well with existing provisions and in Section 19 of the Nature Conservation Act 2004 and Regulation 18 of the Habitats Regulations. In terms of issues to do with cumulative damage and permitted activities and so on, I think that links back to the previous discussion in terms of how if there were a separate ecocide bill that provided a kind of a signal, a signpost of the direction and intent of the environmental regulations overall, then that would need to be reviewed in that wider context, I think.
Okay, thanks. Back to you, Convener.
Thanks. Kevin, I think you've got a supplementary you want to...
Please, Convener. Thank you. Good morning, panel. There is a lot of talk at this moment by some around about a two-tier justice system, which is commentary that I don't normally agree with. However, in terms of the thresholds for liabilities here, where employers or agents may be liable, but in the eyes of many, employees should not be included in this. If I was a director of a company who had put in place a huge amount of safeguards around about the business I was carrying out, a huge amount of training of staff, and yet a member of staff chose to not meet all of the things that they should be doing, why should it be that I could be held liable and not that member of staff who has acted recklessly? Do you think that in terms of some of the proposals that have been put forward by folk as regards this bill creates that two-tier justice system? Is there a danger here? Professor Henry, please.
I'm not sure if I would have thought to describe it as two-tier justice, but in my view it is appropriate given the severity of the problem being addressed and the high bar for criminal liability that individuals should also be able to be prosecuted for and found guilty of this offence, if that was what the evidence suggested. I understand the concerns around employees, but the corporate entity also has to be found guilty if it's to be liable. I think in the situation you suggest, if an individual acts recklessly or with intent to cause harm, then I would suggest they should remain within the provisions of the bill.
Okay. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Please, Ross, if you want to.
Just to agree with Professor Henry.
Does everyone agree with Professor Henry? I'm getting nods. I'm not getting nods from Dr. Mitchell. Do you agree, Dr. Mitchell? Yes.
I do. I was just going to add, there seems to be a parallel here with the culture in some sectors, particularly aviation and construction industry, where those liabilities, as it were, cascade throughout the sector, and they have a healthy approach to dealing with health and safety risks. But I think there's a parallel there with what you're suggesting and what's there as answers.
Thank you.
As well.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks. I'm pleased that was clarified. I was concerned by that when we had that last week. Douglas, I think you've got some questions you want to ask.
Thank Convener. Ross, it's a question for you, actually. So SEPA said in written evidence that while you welcome including vicarious liability, it could also be useful to add provision for vicarious liability where a contractor committed the offence. So can you expand on that and why that would enhance the bill?
Yeah, Mr Lumsden, that was simply to ensure that all people who could have responsibilities and who may breach those responsibilities could be held to account under the bill. So a contractor was an example that was used because if they have been given responsibilities to undertake certain activities and they either act recklessly or they omit to undertake those activities, then it was simply to make sure that all relevant people that could be involved in an act of recklessness or an omission could be captured within the scope of the bill.
So I guess that's similar to the question that Mr Stewart asked, whether there should be some sort of flow down of responsibilities.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go on to defence now. So the committee has received a range of evidence regarding whether or not the defence of necessity is needed and how it might be applied in practice. So what's your views on this? Maybe if I can come to Mark first of all.
So again, I think this is an area where we would be looking for sort of greater clarification in terms of examples of where that could be required or not. It fits into that wider pattern of, I think, a more specificity in terms of what the actual intent of the bill would be in terms of what type of things would be deemed in terms of necessity and which wouldn't. So again, I think it's a need of greater clarification.
And do you think that clarification would come from regulations, or does that need to be on the face of the bill?
I think we'd probably think that could come through regulations or indeed through guidance later on. So.
Okay. Professor Henry, anything to add on that?
I would prefer it to be on the face of the bill.
Oh, right,
That's
okay.
usually my position. I also think that compared to other related defences, so in the 2014 Act, necessities in terms of avoiding significant harm to human health, that's also in the new environmental authorisation regulations, along with natural causes. And I wonder if some thought should be given to a defence related to natural causes. So where there is an extreme natural event that then is linked to the causation of the ecocide. I think there was some discussion at the last committee around the formulation about avoiding other greater harm, and that could, I suppose, come through in regulation or guidance if that's the formulation settled on, but it's not quite clear to me what that would mean.
And I guess who would decide that? That would be a matter for the courts, I would presume, or...
It would be unless there was guidance that bound SEPA, perhaps.
Okay. Professor Gemmell, do you have a view on the defence of necessity?
Yep, I was just waiting to be unmuted there. Yeah, I agree with what's just been said. I think the argument around it was bad, but it could have been worse, it has been heard so many times in the Sheriff Court and elsewhere that it's a wee bit tired, and therefore I think we probably do need some help with this. I think I particularly agree with the point about where natural causes have been involved, and I've just been working extensively in Portugal on wildfires. I think there is a real need to distinguish between deliberate acts of arson, for example, which the police and other parts of the system can handle, and natural events or exacerbated natural events because of poor behaviours, etc. In the case of the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, these matters are often dealt with in pre-pleading discussions. And again, if you have an expert body acting as an intermediary rather than something just coming forward to COPFS or to the Sheriff Court cold, I think there are ways of making this a lot easier than they might be at the moment. But in any case, I think there needs to be care taken about any of this attempted lessening of the seriousness of the offence on argumentation that could be seriously flawed. So yeah, guidance would be helpful, and refinement within the law, I think, would be necessary.
Because I guess if there's not guidance, I'm thinking things like food security, we've had to do that because of food security, energy security as well. There could be damage done, and people would say, well, it was necessary.
Yep, exactly. And I think there have been examples of cases like this that the Health and Safety Executive, which Clive was mentioning, has looked at in significant detail, particularly where the instruction may have been modified as it went towards the worker, and there was then well, I thought I was doing the right thing type argument, but actually, I turned the wrong valve. So who was responsible for that? So it can become very, very messy under those circumstances. I think there needs to be a little bit more help on making sure that they understand what necessity, as well as controlling mind, mean, because when they're working together, they can be particularly difficult.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to that, or I'll move on to my next question then, Camilla. Yes, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you very much. Yes, just to add a couple of points to that, we couldn't think of any examples from a sort of species habitats point of view where that claim could be reasonably met. So, for example, if you were to burn some land in order to create a fire break for a wildfire, the scale of that burning would be much less than the scale required to sort of satisfy any concerns about ecocide. I saw another case associated with the bill to do with water extractions that might affect freshwater pearl mussel during dry periods and so on under a permitted regime. But again, there might be alternatives there to do with provision of water bowsers and so on to supply drinking water for those immediate people affected and so forth. So, I agree that we need some, a lot more guidance on what that would mean in different settings.
Okay, and that links into my next question. So the bill does not explicitly set out that undertaking licensed or consented activities cannot constitute ecocide or provide a defence along these lines, which have raised concerns from different sectors, including farming, fishing and renewables. So is the approach in the bill appropriate, and what are the implications of this to SEPA and Nature Scot as bodies actively involved in consenting and permitting? Maybe I'll stay with you, Dr. Mitchell, on that one, because you did raise that just now.
Yeah, so I think that links, to the previous discussion about cumulative effects and the operation of activities that are currently permitted but cumulatively damaging to ecological systems. And I'm not clear how the bill as drafted deals with that. I think it also relates to some of the other points that have already been made about the situation of this bill, if it were to come through, in relation to the operation of the rest of the sort of environmental regulatory regime. I think all of that's particularly arguably pressing in the sense that a great deal of all of our policies, practices to do with land, uses of the land and sea, developed over the last 50 to 70 years, have largely assumed a stable and predictable climate. But as we're seeing, that's not the world we live in anymore. And the fact that climate's warming, but importantly becoming much more stochastic in terms of extreme events and unusual patterns of weather, I think has a huge bearing on the operation of a lot of our environmental regulation in that new climate, which we haven't had cause to think about before.
Okay. Ross, can I come on to you now about the licensing and consenting piece? If somebody's operating under licence, could they be brought to justice on ecocide?
So in terms of that, to add to Dr. Mitchell's points there, that I mentioned earlier the integrated authorisations framework, so there is quite a lot of work that's been done in terms of streamlining licensing arrangements, and as you've highlighted, it is not a defence within the ecocide bill that somebody's undertaken a licensed or a permitting activities, but it is under the Section 40 bill. So I would probably just highlight the fact that there is a difference there, and I think that points to the need for guidance round about which, if it was a separate bill that was introduced for ecocide, there needs to be strong guidance regarding what becomes an appropriate offence that we would seek to report to COPFS, so that we get the right offence, so that COPFS can take whatever prosecution action they deem necessary. The other thing, if I could maybe just pick up on the necessity point that you raised earlier, I think whether it's within the regulations or whether it's within guidance, the fact that the threshold for an offence is severe harm, I think it really makes it important that there's guidance, because if you're trying to offset severe harm with a necessity argument, then quite clearly what you have offset needs to be quite severe as well. So some guidance round about that would be really helpful because of the threshold of severe within the bill. Thank you.
You know, we spoke about responsibilities flowing down, but if you're responsible for licensing and consenting, are you in danger of committing ecocide if you maybe permit too many things that the responsibility can then go back up to either SEPA or even to the Scottish Government?
Yeah, so that was the point I made earlier, I think, to Mr Ruskell's point, that at the moment, within Section 40, there is a protection for those that permit other activities, if that's through a regulated authorisation. We issue licences and permits in line with environmental legislation, and that is not a defence that is currently available within the ecocide bill. So that is a concern to SEPA, that we've currently got that defence within Section 40, but we don't have that defence as a regulator within the ecocide bill.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add to that?
I think
Professor Henry?
This is at the heart of some of the issues around this bill. So if you're thinking about a one-off catastrophic event, it's entirely appropriate for there not to be a permit defence, and it's unlikely a permit would have included that action. But for long-term cumulative effects, to me, you couldn't look back, you couldn't retrospectively say, well, Scottish Water or a farmer should be liable for what they've done for the last 20 years within the confines of their permits. So that could only be looking forward. And even there, I think that the risks are very high around things like the harm to water, ecological status or climate. You know, these are large, complex environmental issues, so I think there needs to be an awful lot of clarity about not having a permit defence, both for the regulators and the operators, and it would certainly need to be forward-looking.
I mean, I'm a little bit confused by this, because is it not going to put a huge amount of pressure onto the consenting authorities that what they may be consenting to maybe have an effect which they're not entirely aware of at the time? I mean, Campbell mentioned fish farming and the use, say, for example, of slice as a chemical to kill off sea lice, but also kills off other crustaceans. So, you know, what is the long-term effect on that? If this ecocide bill came in, would SEPA be in a position to consent to the use of a chemical which has got an approved on-label use, but the long-term effects are completely unknown? Because you'll be the one then, or SEPA will be the one then, that will be held liable for ecocide under this legislation. Campbell, do you want to, have I got that entirely wrong? And then I'll come to Ross.
You haven't got it entirely wrong. I would agree significantly with what you said, actually. I think there are several levels of this. I mean, clearly a permit should never be permitting extreme harm on a widespread basis. You know, you would assume that was a reasonable starting point. The fact that a lot of agricultural activities, for example, are not actually handled under permit but are handled under guidance, the PEPFA code, etc., that creates already a slightly grey area. But of course, we went to nitrate vulnerable zones partly because individual releases of high nitrate output were then identified as having cumulative as well as direct effects. So the science needs to be sufficiently robust, although clearly there will always be uncertainty. But that is why the precautionary principle exists and why it's meant to be part of the process that we apply to looking to prevent harm. Removing that risk completely is impossible. And so, yes, the regulator might well be liable. And I think there was certainly a case in Austria where the regulator was put in the crosshairs for permitting something that was very quickly discovered to be pernicious in the environment. So that we need to tread relatively carefully there. But I think the nature of permitting, I noticed in an earlier evidence session, was being questioned that permits need to be made as robust as possible in order to be applied. And it's great to hear that SEPA are going through a further process on integrated permitting. But I think we need to be careful about what we open ourselves up to in terms of the risks here. There will be unknowns that we have to subsequently adjust. But that's why permitting should be flexible and should be able to be updated on a regular basis. And I'm sure Clive would have views about other parts of the legislative framework that relate to nature. But when it comes to the brown environment, I think we have relatively good arrangements already in place, and permits should certainly not be used as a defence. It seems wholly inappropriate.
Okay, just before I come to Kevin with a supplementary, Ross, do you want to just answer that? Is SEPA nervous that they may be following procedures and then automatically allow themselves to be hit with an eco-side charge if this bill came into force? I would be. Are you?
I'm not sure I would use the characterisation of nervous, but we've put within our submissions, and I've given evidence today to say that that is currently a gap within the Ecocide Bill, and we would like to see a similar clause put into the if Section 40 and the Ecocide Bill remain as separate entities, we would like to see a clause put in the Ecocide Bill that reflects the clause in relation to permitting authorities that currently exists within Section 40.
Nicely answered. Thank you, Ross. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Convener. And moving this on a little bit and moving beyond permitting and licensing, if other permissions were granted, say by a council planning committee, which led to an ecocide event which was unexpected, are they liable, or would the planning minister be liable if they actually took a decision that led to a perceived or actual ecocide? And let me give you an example, because planning committees, reporters, the planning minister, on a regular basis, gets told that there may be an impact on particular species, or maybe we don't know very much about a particular species, which may only be prevalent in certain areas. What is the impact on those decision makers if they unwittingly agree a permission which leads to what some see as an ecocide event? Professor Henry?
I hesitate to give a very confirmed view. I think the starting point has to be, did they intend to cause that severe harm, or were they reckless as to whether that harm was caused? So I suppose the question is, when that planning framework was designed or implemented by the planning authority, had due consideration been given to the potential impact on that part of the environment or that species? I mean, there is a high criminal bar to be met under the bill as it stands. That's probably all I would want to say.
But that would make folk wary, I would say,
yes,
in terms of almost every single aspect of what they do in these regards. It may well be, I would suggest, that some folks will be unwilling or unwilling to participate or to take these kind of decisions in the future. Would you agree?
Well, I think there would be a lot of guidance required to reassure, in that case, a planning authority. I mean, if you look at the definition of widespread, beyond a limited geographic area impacting on an ecosystem, species, or significant...
Again, those definitions,
yeah.
What is severe? And, it may well be that a species exists in only a very small area. Now, that couldn't be described as widespread, but, is the extinction of a species because of a decision that you unwittingly took an ecocide?
Well, I think I said...
I'm sorry if I'm sounding like I'm playing devil's
I
advocate
said earlier
here,
that
but I think these
yeah,
things are
yeah.
important in terms of
Absolutely.
this bill.
Absolutely. I think widespread, because it has to extend beyond a limited geographic area, would rule out that very situation. But I did say earlier that you might have a very localised species. I think if the planning authority, if nobody knew that species was there, I'm not sure they could be intentional or reckless. But yes, it might have some chilling effect, if you want to put it like that, or it might encourage a high degree of prudence as to the potential damage of a development.
Or it might create complete stasis in certain places.
It might, if there was a fear that a species was threatened in that very specific way.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? Please, Professor Gemmell.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I would have thought that any planning proposal coming forward would be met with a reasonable assessment by the planning officers, and that an environmental impact statement might have been prepared, or at least consideration of the range of issues that might be relevant, and that would define both the likely territorial impact as well as the nature of the impact. I can think of examples, and it relates to SEPA Section 85 powers under the 95 Act, and the way in which local authorities are overseen by SEPA in relation to air pollution, and whether or not that's actually been applied. It's another piece of legislation that's never actually been operationalised, despite it existing to help ensure that air pollution is managed. There are ways in which the existing framework properly applied can constrain issues, and I would have thought there is a perfectly reasonable expectation that that could be done under the Ecocide Act. But I would expect local government to take its responsibilities seriously, and the triage process and assessment process to rule out those things that are local, minor impact, etc. There is no need to, as it were, catastrophise about the potential impact of the legislation, because simple assessment and proper science should clarify what is and isn't relevant.
I don't think I'm trying to catastrophise anything here. I'm just looking at the simple day-to-day business that people have to carry out, and look at what the possible impacts of this piece of proposed legislation may actually be. Convener, I hand back to you.
Yeah, I'm finding that very interesting. The whole issue of the precautionary principle underpins a lot of what we do, and so it may mean that, because of the fear of this, the precautionary principle means that nothing happens. But the Deputy Convener wants to come in.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that theme, because particularly in Ross's comments around the existing provisions within the Section 40 provision around the permit exemption aspect, and the cause and effect if that type of change was not introduced into this particular bill. Does it run the risk, if it wasn't introduced under this bill, is it the precautionary principle effectively goes ramped to the extent that SEPA becomes so risk averse that developments that are seeking permits actually find it quite difficult to get permits, because as a regulator you become increasingly anxious about the liability that you might face at some future point in being pursued for committing ecocide or contributing towards committing ecocide? Is that a risk?
Thanks for the question. I'll probably go to Professor Henry's point that at present we issue permits based on environmental regulations and legislation. It would be very much be our preference for the ecocide bill to have the same clause as the Section 40 clause that's in place. However, it should not be a situation where we are permitting activities that we reasonably believe could cause severe environmental harm anyway. So quite clearly we would need to, any new legislation that comes in, we would need to look at that legislation, we would need to assess it, we would need to provide guidance and training to our staff, and we would need to make sure we had appropriate safeguards in place. And at this stage of the bill's progress, our wishes would be for that protection to be included within the Ecocide Bill that is currently within Section 40.
Yeah, and if it isn't?
If it isn't, then we will need to assess that at the time, and we will need to make sure that we provide appropriate guidance, training, processes for our staff to make sure that we are doubly sure that we are not permitting any activities that could result in severe environmental harm that could then have implications on us as a regulator.
If I can turn to you, Mark, I'm just, you know, as of the regulator of the regulators, if you like, is there a risk here that if this type of exemption wasn't, or provision is not provided for within this bill, is that it could end up driving behaviour that could actually become an inhibitor to developments taking place because they need a licence for it, or actually in some way which could actually lead to potentially further environmental damage in some perverse way. Is there a risk there?
I hesitate to know quite how to reply to that question. There is a risk that it could change regulatory behaviour and make it more risk averse. I think that is the case. But as Ross Haggett has said, all regulation comes with a degree of risk and a degree of judgment that has to be made. And so this, I think, would just be a further component to what is already done by environmental regulators. So the Ecocide Bill, as we have said previously, has a very, very high bar in terms of intent and recklessness. So demonstrating that would be, whether it was for SEPA or for local authorities, would be a very, very significant bar that would have to be cleared before liability was proven. So I don't think it's without risk, but I think it's quite low risk.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Sarah Byatt. Sarah.
Thanks very much, Convener. There have been some questions raised about a code of conduct, failures that are not just a one-off incident or an accident, but to harm caused over time. And I was thinking about repeated failures where it's breached existing environmental legislation, but there's been no action, it's not been taken up, pollution particularly, which hasn't actually triggered legal accountability. And we've got existing legislation, we've got this proposal. Do you think the bill should include the concept of a course of conduct? And would that fill the gap between existing failures and ecocide? Because there's a gap here and the impact of pollution over time. There's no accountability there.
So I'll go first. I think, as I said previously, sort of that question in terms of what is the cumulative impact of a number of events over an extended period of time is something which we're not clear about yet as to how that would be captioned, how that gap, as you described, would be filled. The bill kind of envisages or suggests that it envisages kind of very, very acute, very severe problems. I'm not quite clear how that's going to work with cumulative actions and cumulative impacts over an extended period of time yet. So again, that is one of the areas that we would be suggesting needs further clarification.
Is that clarification in the bill or guidance subsequent to the bill? Because guidance has been mentioned a few times.
I think we would be happy with guidance so that everyone who was subject to it and was implementing those regulations was clear what the expectations were.
Yeah. Anyone else have a view?
I think you said that the context you were speaking about was where somebody had been routinely in breach of licence conditions, and I think that's slightly different from an operator who's been complying with their permit but then discovered...
That's why I raised it,
yes.
actually.
And I think if there has been a long-standing routine breaches of licence conditions and that has resulted in the type of harm that we're talking about here, then to my mind that would be quite appropriate, assuming that one can show either intent or recklessness, which might be easier to show in terms of sustained breaches of licences. So.
Yep, Ross.
It was to focus actually on that repeat breaches of licences or permits. SEPA has got a wide range of enforcement tools available to us, which is also based on guidance that we've received from the Lord Advocate. And one of the things that we take into account when we are determining an appropriate enforcement action, and going up the hierarchy of enforcement action up to and including reporting to Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service are previous actions of individuals or companies. So we absolutely take that into account when we determine enforcement action and moving. It's quite often for us to move individuals or companies up an enforcement hierarchy because of a lot of history of non-compliance that's built up, and that's underpinned by Lord Advocate guidance, and ultimately might lead us to determine that we report somebody to the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service under the existing legislative regime.
Yeah, one of the points made in the earlier questions was about actually the lack of action there, that this does actually happen but without any legal consequence for the perpetrators.
Yeah, we've got a suite of enforcement measures that are open to us that we use on a regular basis, including up to and including reporting people to the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service. There was quite a high-profile case at Kirkcaldy Sheriff Court just last week where we'd reported an operator to COPFS, and that resulted in a guilty verdict. So we do use these tools on an ongoing basis.
Right, so the evidence we had at the start of today's session was talking about the lack of enforcement. So you don't think there is a gap here at all, and that having a higher standard would actually persuade some of those organisations not to break the law in the first place?
Yeah, so in terms of the principles of the Ecocide Bill, as I said earlier on, we are supportive of those principles within the Ecocide Bill. And we can provide some statistics if it would help the committee. I think we've already provided some statistics to SPICE in terms of the amount of time we've used different enforcement activities over the past few years. But we use the tools that we've got at our disposal on a regular basis in an appropriate manner, based on the evidence we've been able to gather, in order to hold people to account when they have undertaken activities that damage the environment. And I'm more than happy to provide some additional statistics to the committee if that would help in that regard.
Well, I think that would be useful, because I'm certainly aware of breaches that nothing happens on, and it's an impact on communities. Any of the other witnesses have any views on this? Yep. Professor?
Thank you. I completely agree with the point, Sarah, you were making. And two observations. One, I think that whatever happens, it will be highly desirable to have further training for COPFS, for sheriffs, for judges, in order to be able to interpret and apply the law appropriately, were we to go down this path. And the second point, I think there is, it would be helpful within the bill to have two different hooks, one for those breaches of licence conditions which have not previously been taken through legal process, versus the cumulative impacts that have not resulted essentially from directly regulated activity. I think they are different things and need to have different and more tailored solutions applied to them. And perhaps in your mind as well, but certainly in mine, there would be cases around the Coal Authority and former ownership of mines. Long Annet, Mossmorran, Grangemouth all breached their, for example, nitrogen dioxide 15-minute limits within their permits, and no action was taken. Some of that resulted from cases that were assembled and went forward, and COPFS chose not to progress them. Some of them went forward to sheriffs, who essentially dismissed them because he or she was going to apply a £300 fine for something that could be considered egregious environmental harm. So there are a number of forms of flaw in application of the existing system, which I think it would be very important not to build into the Ecocide structure. And those two differentiated hooks, I think, would be very helpful to have for subsequent guidance to be developed to support.
That's very helpful, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. The next question's for Tim Mark.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask you about the EU Environmental Crime Directive, about what your view is of the bill. Does it bring us into closer alignment with that directive? And I suppose, reflecting on some of the conversation earlier about Section 40, an alternative approach would be to amend Section 40 offence, perhaps to increase the level of penalties to bring that in line with the Environmental Crime Directive. So I'm interested in your thoughts on the bill. Does that result in alignment, and also whether there are any alternatives to that? Mark, do you want to start that?
Yeah, thank you. So much of the content of the language of the Environmental Crime Directive aligns very much with the kind of language of ecocide and international developments in that area. So from that point of view, it does sort of draw parallels between the two. The penalties envisaged in the bill go further than what's in the Environmental Crime Directive, and creates a new criminal and separate criminal offence, whereas the directive is more about strengthening penalties for existing qualified offences. So it's not a like for like, but there is a parallel to be drawn between the two, we would say.
Okay, Sarah?
Yes, I think broadly this bill would allow Scotland to align and in penalties go beyond what the Crime Directive requires. There should be provision for omissions as well as actions, which I think is also in that directive. A longer period of imprisonment could be built into Section 40 alternatively. And I think there is discussion in the Crime Directive about the permit defence and situations in which a permit defence would not be available. So that's perhaps something that could be looked at, but broadly, yes, I think it does align and go beyond.
Yeah, sorry, just clarify that under the EU Crime Directive, the permit defence is not applied
where there is a manifest substantive failure to comply with the law, regardless of having a permit. I think it's out. There's a form of words that wouldn't be one that we would normally find in our domestic law, but there is a form of manifest breach of substantive legal requirements, I think is the phrase that it uses.
Okay.
Or where a permit had been obtained by fraud or some improper action, corruption, for example, which I think was intended to be focused on waste offences.
Okay, so there would be potentially choices with this bill about to what extent a permit defence could be introduced into the bill and where you draw the line, but your point is that there is a line that's been drawn in the directive. Ross, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I'll probably just, nothing specifically to add to what colleagues have said. I would probably just reiterate the fact that as an independent regulator, it's not for SEPA to make comment on alignment with other jurisdictions. That's a matter for Parliament. However, as I mentioned earlier, criminals don't particularly recognise boundaries. So if one jurisdiction becomes harder for criminals to operate in, it could drive them into others. So from a practical point of view, having a very strong legislative framework within Scotland, I think, is to be beneficial because of the fact that environmental crime does not necessarily know borders. So a strong jurisdiction here would be very helpful.
Yeah. Campbell?
Just one point to add, because I agree with Mark and Sarah's observations. I think one element of ECD that certainly other European countries are underscoring is the way in which the lead agency and supporting agencies in taking forward prosecutions can be empowered, essentially, which in Spain, Portugal, Italy has been very popular because it has allowed the environment regulator to use additional powers that are applied for intelligence gathering, etc., and actual court process to the National Guard, to local enforcement agencies, to the hunting agency, for example, in Italy. So there could be, because I noticed in Clive's evidence that Nature Scott was slightly concerned about their ability to take cases forward in a particular way with prosecutorial type support power. I think it would be helpful just to look at that bit of the ECD and see if that is would be beneficial in any way. But all the other elements of what's been mentioned, I support.
Yeah. Thank you. Clive, do you want to come in?
Thanks. Yes. So, yeah, just in terms of alignment, I think the bill would align with the existing provisions in the EU, as you say, but also the environmental liability regulations cover significant damage to habitats and species of European interest, as it were the habitats regulations. But this bill would extend that in more widely. So that fit is potentially good, subject to the earlier discussion. Yep.
Okay, thank you. We covered earlier the aspects around emissions as well as acts, and I think that's something which is covered by the EU directive. But there's another area which has been raised with us, and that's the approach to financial penalties, including confiscation of proceeds of crime, is something that the EU directive has reference to. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that?
That would be an appropriate penalty, but I think that would already be available under other legislation.
Under other legislation, you mean in relation to the
confiscate
Section
proceeds
40?
of crime. So I think that would certainly be appropriate to have that as well.
Okay. Any further reflections on that point?
It's not an element of the bill that we've considered, so nothing further to add.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Clive wanted to come in, but I was going to ask you a question, so I'll let you in, Clive, and then you can realise that my question's coming to you, the next one.
Okay, thank you. Yes, just on the penalties, we thought it would be important, whatever the kind of custodial sentence might be and proceeds, profits from crime and so on, to also have some remedial actions if they're within the control of the perpetrator, to restore the damage that's been done as far as possible. To avoid the instance where nature is just left by somebody else to be restored rather than the person who's committed that act.
Is that something that's reflected in the crime directive, environmental crime directive?
Sorry, I couldn't hear it fading in there.
Is that something that is reflected in the EU crime directive?
I'd have to check.
Okay. Sarah, is that under reparation?
I think not. I think that's really the Environmental Liability Directive, which very much focuses on operators being expected to remediate harm. And I assume this was a deliberate choice in this bill that that's not the case, because it is in almost every other control regime that I can think of. SEPA's starting point, or the courts, would be to require the operator or the person who caused the harm to make good. Whereas here, as far as I can see, there's been a choice that wouldn't happen, perhaps because they can't be trusted or wouldn't do it properly. But I would have thought, if only for the financial consequences for SEPA or Nature Scot, whoever it would be, that where appropriate, and assuming that the perpetrator was considered to be competent and reliable and would do it, that should be there as well, that they should take action first, and only where they failed to do so or couldn't do so would a public authority step in and do it, and then have to recover costs. So,
right, that was a useful addition, convener. So.
Okay, Clive, I warned you it was coming to you next. There's suggestion in the bill, or suggestion that Nature Scot haven't got enough powers to investigate potential or severe damage to protected sites or species. Does Nature Scot want more powers in the bill, or do you generally want more powers? Within the bill, or more powers?
Well, I think the provisions for protected sites, there are provisions that we can use to prosecute damage on those sites, and we do use them. Where things might get more challenging for us in relation to this bill would be, well, a combination of factors, I think, because the potential penalties are custodial, and so the evidential bar, most of the, sorry, I should have started with the other regulations that we have. The penalties are typically fines. There's obviously a lot of discussion about, how they're levied in terms of forming deterrents to activities and so on. But under this bill, where there's a custodial sentence, obviously the evidential bar is that much higher. The cases are likely, given on our experience with the environmental liabilities regulations as they are, we would envisage these potential cases of ecocide being that slightly complicated. relatively infrequent. So testing, I think, for authorities who are not using, like us, those provisions very regularly and perhaps once in a career, so to speak. As the bill stands, we would need to act with SEPA to direct us to those kind of investigatory powers. But normally we rely on the police to do that work for us because they're so much better at it, frankly. And obviously, if we get it wrong because we're rusty or whatever, that threatens the case through the courts.
Okay, thank you. We'll just leave it at that, I think, at that stage then. Douglas, you, and then I'm going to come to Monica for a few questions at the end.
Thanks, Convener. First question was around the financial memorandum, just whether you've actually had a chance to review that and whether you think the figures in there are appropriate. Might come to you first, Mr Roberts.
Yes, we have had a chance and we think the figures are appropriate. It would be a small level of familiarisation for my staff in terms of understanding the new legislation, but we think the figures, as we have said to the Finance and Public Administration Committee, are appropriate.
So the ongoing training figure in there, that seems enough, and that would embed the Ecocide Bill into your organisation. Okay. Ross, I'll come to you as well from a SEPA point of view.
Yeah, thanks very much. So, yeah, we've looked at the financial memorandum. Our only concern in relation to the financial memorandum is a potential underestimation of the costs that may be borne to SEPA. And it goes to the point that Dr Mitchell's just spoken about regarding who will have investigatory powers under the Ecocide Bill. And as things currently stand, the Environment Act of 1995 would be amended to enable organisations to investigate ecocide-level offences, and that would fall on SEPA and local authorities or waste collection authorities. So it may well be, if SEPA were to investigate things that don't currently sit within our regulatory ambit, then that would provide additional costs to SEPA, or alternatively other agencies could be given those investigatory powers, such as Nature Scot, that would remove that requirement for SEPA to investigate things out with our current regulatory ambit.
So I guess if there's not new money coming for those investigations to take place, then you would have to cut back on other things that you were doing.
Yeah, and it's not so much those investigations that are within our current regulatory sphere, because as I mentioned earlier, we would investigate those occurrences anyway, and it may well be that if there was uncertainty regarding whether it's the Ecocide Bill or whether it's Section 40 would apply, we would, one of our options is to report both into COPFS or take guidance from them. The issue here would be if we were to go and investigate things that are out with our current regulatory responsibilities, then that would add an additional burden to us, and then would be a cost on the organisation.
And you mentioned local authorities as well. I guess they might be asked to investigate.
I would assume so.
Yeah. Dr Mitchell, can I come to you on the same sort of question in terms of the finances? Do you see that covering what you may have to do?
Sorry, waiting to be unmuted. So I think the figures on the face of it, similar to Ross's answer, are probably okay. The difficulty is in the operation of the training required and maintaining that training when it's only been used, as it were, once in the blue moon. Obviously, the proficiency with which any organisation can deliver the training under the provisions of the law rests an awful lot on familiarity with those cases, particularly as they progress through the courts and so on. So I would worry that maintaining that level of training and proficiency might actually cost quite a lot more than the actual figures display.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. The last question I had, Convener, was around reporting. So the Scottish Government has said in its memorandum on the bill that it intends to seek to remove the reporting provision at stage 2. Do you agree with the Government's position on this. I'll stick with Dr Mitchell on this first of all.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the Scottish Government has said in its memorandum on the bill that it intends to seek to remove the reporting provision at stage 2. Do you agree with their position on that?
I think I'd have to come back to you in writing on that one.
Okay,
I'm afraid.
No problem at all. Anybody else want to come in there on reporting? No takers? Or, sorry, Professor Hendry?
There may be a reporting requirement in the Crime Directive, I'm not sure. So that's possible, but no other comment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Convener.
Now I'm going to turn to Monica, in case you've got a couple of questions, Monica, that you want to put to the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Convener, and thank you to all the panel for your time today. It was just mentioned a moment ago, but the Scottish Government very helpfully sent a memorandum about the bill to the committee a few weeks ago, and says that government is supportive of the proposal to introduce an offence of ecocide properly understood as being for the most extreme, willful and reckless cases of harm. So we've had a lot of discussion today about the potential overlap, or how the RRA and Ecocide Bill can complement one another. On this point of the most extreme impact and harm against the environment, how important is that the public and everyone involved in looking after the environment understands that we are talking about the most severe harm? And would you agree that having a standalone Ecocide Scotland Act eventually, hopefully, sends that important signal that we are talking about something really quite severe and quite distinct? I don't know who would like to go first. Not everyone needs to answer because I'll be told off for time, but Professor Hendry, perhaps.
I agree that this should be targeted at the most extreme harm. I would like to see that more strongly expressed on the face of the bill, how severe is different from significant. And I think that would be one of the benefits of a standalone act, was that it would bring attention to it, a wider attention than just SEPA's attention or some operators' attention.
Thank you. And I see Ross Haggart is nodding along, so are you agreeing with Professor Hendry?
Yes, thanks, Ms Lennon, very much so. And while we have put in our written evidence, while I've stated today that our preference for clarity would be to amend Section 40, we do recognise that in terms of a deterrent effect, a standalone act will be very strong. So we do recognise that as well.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think Professor Gemmell's also nodding. Is there anything you wanted to add? Oh, double thumbs up.
Okay, no, I was simply agreeing completely. I think the standalone impact is required, and it completes the system. I think public education and information would be really valuable at an appropriate point, because I think it would help people to understand that there is a sort of regulatory pyramid structure and why Ecocide would be at the top of that. But I think that should be something that all of the relevant bodies, including Scottish Government, would put in place. So yeah, completely supportive.
And just a brief supplementary to that, Professor Gemmell, while we've got you unmuted. This is obviously part of the stage 1 scrutiny, and there's been a lot of consultation and front-loading of the bill until we get to this stage. And given where we are in the parliamentary cycle, where we're looking at dissolution sometime in March, do you agree that there's been a benefit in having public discussion and public engagement around this bill, which makes this a more transparent process, particularly because we are talking about severe penalties and severe punishments? So to get that public buy-in, do you agree that this has been a robust process?
Leading the witness, my lad. But yes, I agree with you. I think it has felt slightly different in that sense, but I think that's an important thing. I don't think that ends the desirability and responsibility to communicate, but I think that's been a very helpful differentiator here. And I think, going back to the response I gave to the convener early on, I think it is incredibly important to make sure that there is a good level of understanding here and that it is likely to be a rarity in its application. But that highlights, in a sense, how much more important it is to sit at the top of the structure for the most egregious and high-impact acts. So, yeah, I think good so far, more as ever to do.
Thank you. I've just got two, I think, final brief questions. So one is on the planning system, because it was mentioned earlier. As a former Chartered Town Planner, I can't help myself but just ask for some clarity around that. So is it the case currently that planning authorities already have a legal and a policy requirement to assess the impact of developments and plans and decisions on nature and climate? There's clearly a role through the National Planning Framework 4, for example. So I don't know if anyone could briefly just put my mind at rest that planners and others in the planning authority are already well accustomed to that, and there's a range of tools available to aid that decision-making process.
Monica, I don't know if you saw it, saying that he wanted to come in immediately.
Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I can outline some of the basic provisions, and some of it links back to the earlier discussion with Mr. Stewart and the Deputy Convener as well. So yes, planning authorities do have to consider the impacts on the environment. There are a number of ways in which that's done at the policy level through strategic environmental assessments, at a project level through environmental impact assessments for certain types of development. But all applications are subject to that scrutiny. The point I was going to make in relation to the earlier discussion relating to the precautionary principle and so on is that under the National Planning Framework 4, that the proposals to introduce the notion of positive effects for biodiversity to deal with the extent to which potential damage can be addressed on-site or off-site in sort of closely relevant habitats and species and so on. Obviously, it's not easy to replicate ancient woodland, but there are other provisions that can be brought in that remediate or alleviate some of the damage that might be caused by some particular developments. And then finally, under the habitats regulations, there are provisions to consider issues of overriding public interest as well. So to align with EU law, that those provisions are in place as well. Thank you,
Dr. Mitchell. And just lastly, to wrap up a couple of points. So I've just come back from a conference in London on ecocide law, human rights and environmental justice, and there was people there from around the world providing legal expertise as well. So it's very clear there's momentum towards criminalising ecocide at an international level and international crime, but also a lot going on, not just in the EU, but around the world, where we're seeing domestic bills or acts coming forward. It's already been mentioned by Ross Haggart that criminals don't respect boundaries, and I guess they would look for what is seen as sometimes low risk and high value activity. We know that waste crime, for example, is a big issue, and Interpol have been doing some work on that in recent weeks. So the EU Environmental Crime Directive has to come into effect in all the member states in May next year, so things are moving very fast. Given that we've heard reports, including recently from the House of Lords, that waste crime, environmental crime is a fast-growing area of crime. What could the risk to Scotland be if we don't have an ecocide crime, set out in criminal law, when lots of our neighbours and partners around the world are very active in this space? So because Ross is nodding, I'll come to you, Ross, and if anyone wants to add in briefly, that would be great.
I think it just goes to the point that I made earlier that, and you've reiterated yourself, that crime doesn't know any borders or boundaries. So if you've got a jurisdiction that makes it more difficult or ramps up the risk for people acting in a criminal manner, they could move on to other jurisdictions. So I think there is a risk if there are other jurisdictions that have got stronger legislation than Scotland, that criminals see Scotland as an opportune place to move to undertake crime.
I don't think there's anyone else signalling to respond, Convener, so thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thanks very much, Monica. And that brings us to the end of our session. I think, Clive, you offered to write to the committee. The clerks will follow up that with you on what you've actually offered to do to make sure we get it back, as it were. I'm going to suspend the meeting for 5 minutes. And then we'll move into private session before coming back into public session. So I'd ask committee members to be back here at 10:56. And again, thank you to the witnesses for the evidence they've given this morning. I suspend the meeting.